The night was thick with silence, broken only by the distant squeals of wild pigs. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman's muffled screams cut through the air, desperate, terrified, and unheard by anyone who could save her. Beneath the moonlit Sicilian countryside in Italy, a betrayal unlike any other was about to be repaid in the most brutal way imaginable. A man stood at the edge of a pit, his expression cold, his decision final. He had once worshipped the woman before him. She was his queen, his confidant, the only person he ever let his guard down for. But she had been living a lie. She wasn't his. She never was. She had spent years weaving a deception so deep that even he, the most feared mafia boss in Sicily, had fallen for it. And now, with his empire at stake, there was only one way this story could end. The animals below were restless, their hunger undeniable. One by one, her family had already been swallowed by the darkness, their cries fading into nothing. Now, she was the last piece of unfinished business. He took one final step forward, leaned in, and whispered the last words she would ever hear, "In another life, you could have been my queen. But in this one, you're just pig food." Tonight, love, loyalty, and betrayal would be buried in the same unmarked grave. But what he didn't know was that this act of vengeance would set off a chain of events that would destroy everything he had built. Before we go further, let me know in the comments, what's the worst betrayal you've ever witnessed? Because this one might just top them all. Don Vito Romano was not just a mafia boss, he was the mafia boss. His name alone sent shivers down the spines of both criminals and law enforcement. Ruthless, calculated, and deeply rooted in the old ways, he ran his empire like a godfather from a bygone era. From drug trafficking to money laundering and contract killings, there wasn't a crime in Sicily he didn't have his hands in. Politicians, police chiefs, even judges, many were either on his payroll or too terrified to stand against him. For decades, he built his kingdom brick by brick, eliminating anyone who dared to challenge him. But his power didn't just come from his wealth or influence. It came from fear. Don Vito didn't just kill his enemies, he erased them. And he had a method so terrifying that even the most hardened criminals whispered about it in hushed tones. Deep in the Sicilian countryside, hidden beyond acres of vineyards and olive groves, Don Vito owned a private pig farm, a place where problems disappeared, never to be found again. No bodies. No evidence. Just bones buried beneath the dirt. It was a silent warning to anyone who dared cross him. At his side stood Isabella Moretti, the envy of every mafia wife. Beautiful, poised, and dangerously intelligent, she was the perfect match for a man of his status. To the outside world, she was the epitome of loyalty. A woman who adored her husband, lived by his rules, and embraced the luxury of mafia life. She knew how to play the role perfectly. The elegant dinners, the grand parties, the unwavering devotion to her husband, it was all an act. Because behind the designer dresses and diamond necklaces, Isabella Moretti was not who she claimed to be. She was a weapon. A lie wrapped in silk. And she had spent years crafting her betrayal so flawlessly that even Don Vito himself never saw it coming. For years, the FBI had been after Don Vito. His operations spanned across continents, flooding the streets with drugs and turning entire cities into his playground. But every time they got close, he slipped through their fingers. He was too careful, too connected, too untouchable. That's when they devised a plan so risky that it could either take him down or get their agent killed. They planted Isabella Moretti into his world. Her mission? To infiltrate, gain his trust, and gather enough evidence to dismantle his empire from the inside. She played her role masterfully. For years, she lived as his wife, watching, listening, recording. Every business deal, every murder order, every secret whispered in the dead of night, she fed it all to the FBI, slowly building the case that would finally bring Don Vito down. But there was one thing she never accounted for. That he would find out. And when he did, her betrayal would cost more than just her life. Don Vito had always trusted his instincts. In the criminal underworld, paranoia was a survival skill, and ignoring that gut feeling often led to an early grave. But with Isabella, he had let his guard down. He loved her. He believed in her. And that was his greatest mistake. It started with a phone call. Late one night, as he walked past Isabella's study, he heard hushed whispers. Her voice was different, low, urgent. She spoke in English, a language she rarely used around him. That alone was strange. But it was the way she said certain words, operation, final phase, evidence, that sent a chill down his spine. He stood in the shadows, listening. Every fiber of his being screamed that something was wrong. The moment she hung up, she turned, and froze. He was standing in the doorway, watching. Who was that? His voice was calm, but there was a deadly edge beneath it. Isabella was quick. Too quick. She forced a laugh, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Just a friend from America. Lies. That night, Don Vito didn't sleep. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat in his study, and began digging into the past of the woman he thought he knew. And what he found? It shattered him. Isabella had never been his. Not truly. Not even from the start. Her real name wasn't even Moretti. The FBI had placed her in his life, trained her, built an entire fake identity around her. And it didn't stop there. Her entire family, her parents and 2 brothers, were part of the operation. They had helped her infiltrate his world. His wife, his queen, had been nothing more than a beautiful lie. Rage burned through him like wildfire. This wasn't just betrayal, this was war. And in the Mafia, there was only one rule: traitors don't get second chances. But killing Isabella alone wasn't enough. He needed to make an example out of her. Don Vito was a master at deception. If she had been playing him for years, he would play her right back. The next morning, he kissed her forehead like nothing had changed. He poured her coffee, smiled at her jokes, ran his fingers through her hair. She never saw the darkness behind his eyes. While she went about her day, thinking she had him fooled, his men were already moving. In the dead of night, they stormed the homes of her family. No one saw them coming. Her parents. Her brothers. They were dragged from their beds, gagged, and thrown into blacked-out SUVs. By the time Isabella sensed something was wrong, it was too late. She walked into their bedroom, only to be met by 2 of Don Vito's enforcers. Before she could scream, a cloth was pressed over her mouth. The world went dark. When she woke up, her nightmare had only just begun. Because she wasn't in their home anymore. She was at the pig farm. And standing before her, with cold, merciless eyes, was the man she once thought she had fooled. Don Vito. And behind him? Her entire family, bound and terrified, staring at the pits where the wild pigs waited, hungry, restless, and ready to feast. The air was thick with the stench of blood and rot. The pig farm, hidden deep in the Sicilian countryside, was where Don Vito made people disappear. No graves. No evidence. Just gnashing teeth and bones turned to dust. Isabella's wrists were bound, her body trembling as she stared at the pit below. The pigs were restless, their guttural squeals filling the air, they smelled flesh, and they were hungry. Behind her, Don Vito stood motionless, watching her with a cold, unreadable expression. "I gave you everything," he murmured, his voice eerily calm. "Power. Protection. A life most women could only dream of." He stepped closer, tilting her chin up so she was forced to look him in the eyes. She had never seen him like this before, so controlled, so terrifyingly still. "But you were never mine," he continued. "Were you, Isabella?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. Her mother's screams shattered the silence. Two of Don Vito's men dragged Isabella's mother to the edge of the pit. Her wrists were bound, her nightgown torn, her face streaked with tears. "Mama!" Isabella screamed, thrashing against her restraints. Her mother sobbed, turning to Don Vito. "Please, we were only following orders. We had no choice." "No choice." Don Vito echoed, a slow smirk creeping across his face. "Neither do the pigs." With a flick of his wrist, his men pushed her forward. She tumbled into the pit. The pigs were on her instantly. Her screams tore through the night. High-pitched, raw, the sound of sheer terror. The animals swarmed, hooves trampling, teeth sinking into flesh. The wet, crunching sounds of bones snapping were worse than the screaming. Isabella collapsed to her knees, her body shaking violently. She couldn't breathe. Don Vito crouched beside her, whispering, "You should watch. This is what happens to traitors." Her father was next. Then her younger brother. The screams never stopped. Her older brother, Matteo, was the last. Unlike the others, he didn't beg. He stood tall, jaw clenched, staring at Don Vito with pure hatred. "You think this ends with us?" Matteo spat. "They will come for you. The FBI. Your enemies. You're dead, Don Vito, you just don't know it yet." Don Vito chuckled. "Then let's make sure there's nothing left for them to find." Matteo didn't flinch as he was thrown in. But within seconds, the pigs dragged him down. His defiance turned into agony, his final screams muffled beneath the feeding frenzy. Silence followed. Isabella was barely conscious. Her body was limp, her mind shattered. The people she loved were gone, devoured before her eyes. But Don Vito wasn't finished. He lifted her chin again, forcing her to meet his gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something dangerous. "In another life," he murmured, "you could have been my queen." A tear slipped down her cheek. For a second, just a second, she thought he might let her go. But then he smiled. "But in this one, you're just pig food." He shoved her forward. She stumbled, her screams piercing through the night, until they were drowned out by the sound of hungry, snarling pigs. No bodies. No evidence. Just silence. And Don Vito, walking away, leaving behind nothing but ghosts and bones. In the weeks following Isabella's disappearance, whispers spread across Sicily like wildfire. Don Vito had always been feared, but now, he was something more, a legend wrapped in terror. The message was clear: betrayal meant death. And not just for the traitor, but for their entire bloodline. His men spoke in hushed tones, avoiding his gaze. Rival families hesitated to challenge him. Even his most brutal enemies feared crossing him now. Don Vito had done the unthinkable. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Isabella had left behind one final weapon. Isabella had always known this mission could cost her life. That's why she planned for the worst. Before she was exposed, she had managed to hide a single flash drive containing months' worth of incriminating evidence, secret meetings, drug shipments, money laundering, and even confessions straight from Don Vito's mouth. She had sent it to the one person she trusted outside the FBI, her handler. When she and her family vanished, the FBI knew what had happened. But knowing wasn't enough, they needed proof. And then, they found it. The flash drive surfaced, and with it, everything changed. With evidence stronger than ever before, the FBI launched the biggest Mafia takedown in Sicilian history. Wiretaps. Surveillance. Paid informants. Every angle was covered. And then, the first betrayal came. One of Don Vito's most trusted men flipped. Then another. And another. The walls around him started to crumble. Rival families saw weakness. His empire began to rot from within. Shipments were seized. His businesses were raided. Money stopped flowing. And worst of all, his own men turned against him. The FBI didn't just want to take Don Vito down, they wanted to bury him. And so, on a cold Sicilian morning, they made their move. Over 100 agents, backed by Italian law enforcement, surrounded his estate. Helicopters roared overhead, armored vehicles blocked every escape. But Don Vito wasn't going down without a fight. His men opened fire. Bullets tore through the walls, shattering windows, ripping through furniture. The estate became a war zone. For over an hour, the firefight raged. One by one, his soldiers fell. And then, finally, it was over. Don Vito, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the shoulder, was dragged out in handcuffs. His once loyal empire was gone. His power, stripped away. As he was loaded into an FBI transport, an agent leaned in, whispering. "Isabella sends her regards." Humiliated. Powerless. And bound for a U.S. prison. This was how the most feared Mafia lord in Sicily fell. The courtroom in New York City was packed, FBI agents, reporters, former Mafia associates, and even the families of Don Vito's victims. Everyone wanted to see how it would end. The prosecution held nothing back. They played the recordings Isabella had risked her life to obtain. The jury listened as Don Vito's voice confessed to murders, drug deals, and extortion, his own words sealing his fate. One by one, his former allies took the stand, trading their loyalty for leniency. And then, the final piece of evidence, the pig farm. Forensic teams had uncovered bone fragments buried deep in the soil. Isabella's family had vanished without a trace, but science never forgets. When the verdict was read, there was no emotion on Don Vito's face. Guilty. Life in prison. No parole. No escape. The empire he built crumbled before his eyes. Inside the FBI, Isabella's name became legend. A woman who infiltrated the most dangerous Mafia family in Sicily, knowing it could cost her everything. Her story was told in training rooms, her courage inspiring future undercover agents. She had given her life, but her mission was not in vain. The Mafia empire she took down would never rise again. Don Vito sat in his cold, windowless cell, a man who once ruled an empire, now reduced to just another prisoner in an orange jumpsuit. Years passed. The outside world moved on. But inside his mind, she never left. At night, he swore he could hear her voice, a whisper in the dark. Sometimes, he saw her reflection in the metal bars. Other times, he swore he caught her shadow passing by his cell. And then came the worst nights, when he smelled the pigs. The distant squeals. The stench of death. His own mind became his prison. In the end, he had won the battle, but lost the war. And that, my friends, is how one of the most feared Mafia lords in history lost everything. But what do you think? Did Don Vito get what he deserved, or did Isabella take too big of a risk? Let me know in the comments below. And if you love true crime stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. See you in the next one.